35 feet inside the mountain, Walter's flashlight landed on rusted bunk beds buried beneath the stone. Rock dust exploded through the tunnel as Walter slammed against the limestone wall, his injured shoulder going numb instantly. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Ranger barked once. Sharp, urgent. Walter lifted his flashlight with shaking hands, and the beam caught rusted metal bunk beds lined up beneath the mountain like somebody had been waiting underground for decades. Outside, the storm kept getting worse. Would you keep going deeper or turn around? The courthouse in Mercer County had smelled the same for as long as Walter Hayes could remember. Old paper, coffee gone cold, damp wool in winter. The kind of smell that settled into the walls and never left. Walter sat near the back of the law office with Ranger stretched beside his boots. The German shepherd stayed quiet, ears alert, amber eyes moving from person to person without turning his head. Across the table, Eli Grayson leaned back in his chair with one ankle over his knee. He kept checking his phone between sentences like the whole afternoon was an inconvenience. Two other cousins sat nearby pretending not to watch the paperwork too closely. Outside, rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows. Inside, the attorney cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Calvin Grayson's final property transfer, he said. Black Hollow Ridge parcel, approximately 47 acres. Eli gave a short laugh before the man even finished reading. Lord, he muttered, that old rock pile. One cousin smiled into his coffee cup. Another shook his head slowly. Didn't think anybody still wanted that land. Walter said nothing. He sat with his hands folded loosely while the attorney continued through tax records and parcel numbers. The words blurred together after a while. Timber restrictions, access easements, mineral surveys that had expired decades earlier. He knew enough about land to hear the important parts. No power lines, no active well, no structures still standing. Annual taxes due every fall. Not valuable land, just expensive enough to become a burden. The attorney finally looked up. Mr. Hayes, he said carefully, your uncle left Black Hollow Ridge entirely to you. Silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then Eli snorted. Cal knew exactly what he was doing, he said. Dumped the useless ground on the only one crazy enough to keep it. A few quiet chuckles moved through the room. Walter didn't react. Years earlier, he might have. Before Afghanistan. Before long nights working alone in repair shops while everybody else built families and routines that stayed steady. Now he just listened. Ranger rose slowly onto his paws. Not aggressive, not nervous, interested. The attorney slid an old survey map across the desk toward Walter. The paper looked brittle around the folds. Ranger stepped forward immediately and lowered his nose near the bottom corner. Walter noticed it right away. The dog stiffened. Not much, just enough. Ranger sniffed once more near the faded outline of Black Hollow Ridge, then looked toward the window like he heard something far away. Walter rested a hand lightly against the dog's neck. Easy. Ranger settled again, but his ears, stayed forward. Eli noticed and smirked. Even the dog thinks that place is cursed. Nobody said cursed, one cousin muttered. Same difference, Eli replied. Nothing grows up there except brush and bad memories. The attorney cleared his throat again, trying to move things along. There was an old mining survey in the 70s, he explained. Company pulled out before development started. Terrain was unstable. Access costs too high. Walter finally spoke. Anybody been up there lately? Eli shrugged. Why would they? The answer came too fast. Walter filed that away quietly. He'd spent too many years around men who answered questions before thinking. Usually meant they were uncomfortable. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. No dramatic arguments, no shouting over money. Just papers sliding across desks and relatives gathering coats while pretending not to judge each other too openly. That was how families worked around here. Outside, cold rain drifted across Main Street in thin gray sheets. Walter walked Ranger toward his truck parked beside the courthouse steps. His old Ford rattled and idle even after all the repairs he'd poured into it over the years. Ranger jumped into the passenger side automatically. Walter sat behind the wheel for a long moment, without turning the key. Black Hollow Ridge. 47 acres of useless mountain land. He already knew what Eli thought he should do. Sell fast, avoid taxes, walk away before winter. Maybe that was the smart move. Work had been thin lately. The transmission job he finished last week barely covered rent on the converted garage behind Mrs. Delaney's house. His savings account kept shrinking a little at a time. Groceries, fuel, Ranger's arthritis medication. Property taxes on forgotten mountain land were the kind of thing that ruined men slowly. He started the truck anyway. On the passenger seat sat the folded survey map. Ranger kept staring at it. That bothered Walter more than he wanted to admit. By the time he reached the edge of town, the rain had turned into sleet. Headlights stretched pale across wet pavement, while the mountains disappeared into low clouds beyond the highway. West Virginia in November always looked tired. Walter drove to the small garage apartment he rented behind an auto body shop. The place had once been storage for lawn equipment, before the owner added insulation and a shower stall sometime in the 90s. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. Usually, he heated canned stew on a portable burner while Ranger settled near the door. The old tin roof above them clicked softly as the temperature dropped. Walter unfolded the survey map across the small kitchen table. Black Hollow Ridge curved across the paper like a scar. Steep elevation lines, old service roads, one abandoned extraction site marked near the eastern slope. He studied the map the same way he used to study terrain sketches overseas. Habit more than intention. Looking for access points, exposure, places where weather could turn dangerous fast. Ranger stood again. The dog crossed the room slowly and pressed his nose against the map once more, right near the old mining section. Walter frowned. What is it? Ranger gave no answer, of course, just stared toward the dark window above the sink. Then the wind hit the side of the garage, hard. The loose metal roofing groaned instantly. Walter froze before he realized he was doing it. For half a second, the sound wasn't wind anymore. It was rotor wash. Distant blades cutting through darkness. His chest tightened automatically. Ranger moved beside him immediately, leaning solid weight against his knee, grounding him. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. The garage returned around him piece by piece. Tin roof, weak kitchen light, rain tapping the windows. Not Afghanistan, not a night operation, just weather. He rubbed a hand across his face and turned off the burner. Sleep didn't come easy after that. He lay awake on the narrow bed, while Ranger watched the door from the floor nearby. Every gust of mountain wind scraped across the roof like something searching for a way inside. Around 2 a.m, Walter finally gave up trying to sleep. He sat at the table again and looked down at the survey map under the dim light. Black Hollow Ridge. 47 acres nobody wanted. He told himself he'd drive up there tomorrow for one reason only. One look. That was it. Then he'd decide whether the land was worth keeping or selling before the taxes buried him. Simple. But sometime before dawn, Ranger lifted his head toward the dark mountains beyond town and let out a low growl that Walter had never heard before. Not fear. Recognition. And for the first time since leaving the courthouse, Walter felt something colder than mountain wind move quietly through him. He was on the road before sunrise. The Ford climbed north through narrow Appalachian backroads while fog drifted low across the hillsides. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat the entire drive, unusually alert. Every few miles, the dog lifted his nose toward the cracked window, as if searching for a scent buried somewhere ahead. Walter drove mostly in silence. The heater barely worked. Old country radio faded in and out between static. Pine-covered ridges rolled past beneath a pale gray sky that promised more snow before the week ended. Black Hollow Ridge appeared slowly through the morning fog. At first it looked exactly the way Eli described it. Dead ground. The ridge rose steep and uneven above the tree line, scarred by old excavation cuts and stripped patches of stone where nothing seemed willing to grow. Rusted poles leaned crooked along what had once been an access road. Half-buried cable spools sat frozen in weeds taller than the hood of Walter's truck. Nobody had worked this land in a long time. Walter parked beside a collapsed gate hanging from one hinge. The wind hit him the moment he stepped out. Sharp, constant, colder up here than in town. Ranger jumped down beside him and immediately started moving ahead along the old gravel path, paws crunching over frost-stiff grass. Walter grabbed his canvas pack from the truck bed. Rope, flashlights, water, tent tarp, basic cold weather gear. Not enough for a long stay, but enough to spend a day looking around. That was still the plan. One day, he locked the truck out of habit and studied the ridge carefully before moving forward. Old reflexes never fully disappeared. High ground first, possible shelter second. Always track exits before entering unfamiliar terrain. The abandoned mining road curved upward through cedar and exposed limestone. In places, erosion had eaten half the trail away. Walter noticed tire ruts near the lower slope, though not recent ones. Probably hunters. Maybe survey crews years back. Ranger stopped suddenly near a rusted warning sign half buried in brush. Danger, unstable ground. Most of the lettering had faded away. Walter crouched near the signpost. The metal bolts anchoring it were nearly orange with rust, but something else caught his eye nearby. Steel reinforcement rods. Old ones, driven deep into stone near the edge of the slope. He frowned. Mining companies usually didn't reinforce isolated surface rock unless there had been concern about collapse or ventilation shafts underneath. The thought stayed with him as he continued higher. By noon, clouds had thickened overhead. Wind swept hard across the ridge crest, carrying loose grit against his jacket. Walter secured a tarp between two cedar trunks near an exposed rock shelf to break the worst of the gusts. Functional, not comfortable. Ranger paced the perimeter while Walter worked. The dog kept circling toward the eastern side of the ridge. Same direction every time. Walter noticed it after the third pass. "What is it, buddy?" Ranger paused near a cluster of broken limestone and stared downhill. Not barking. Waiting. Walter followed. The slope narrowed there. Jagged stone pushed through thin soil at sharp angles. Several sections looked unstable enough to break loose under heavy snow. Walter moved carefully, testing footing before shifting weight. Then he felt it. Air. Cold wind already covered the ridge, but this felt different. Focused. Steady. Like breath moving through a pipe. Walter stopped beside a narrow crack running vertically through the limestone wall. At first glance, it looked natural. Just another fracture in old mountain stone. But the airflow coming through it stayed constant, even when the outside wind shifted. Ranger moved closer immediately, nose low against the rock. Walter crouched and pressed a gloved hand near the opening. Cold air rushed outward from somewhere deep inside the ridge. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough to feel wrong. He scanned the surrounding area more carefully now. Loose rock, old drill marks, half-buried steel bolts near the edge of the fracture. Somebody had worked here before. The realization tightened something in his chest. Not treasure. Not secret bunkers from movies. Real structures left behind by real people usually meant danger. Collapse. Bad air. Flooding. Walter leaned sideways and shined his flashlight into the crack. The beam disappeared fast into darkness, too deep for a simple surface fracture. Ranger let out a low sound in his throat. Walter looked at the dog. "You hear something?" Ranger's ears twitched once. Then the wind changed. A long, hollow tone rolled out through the crack. Low at first, then louder. Walter froze instantly. His body reacted before his mind did. His hand snapped toward the pistol holstered beneath his jacket. The sound shifted again through the stone. Rhythmic now, deep and uneven. Rotor blades, far away but coming closer. His pulse spiked hard. Dust, heat, radio chatter, night movement beyond wire. For one fractured second, Black Hollow Ridge disappeared entirely. Then Ranger slammed his shoulder hard against Walter's leg. Walter stumbled backward onto loose gravel. The sound broke apart immediately. Not helicopters. Wind. Just wind forcing through narrow stone somewhere underground. Walter sucked in a sharp breath and looked around the ridge again. Gray sky. Cold cedar. No desert heat. No burning fuel. Ranger stood directly in front of him now, staring up with rigid focus. Walter rested both hands on the dog's neck until his breathing slowed. "I'm good," he muttered quietly. But his voice sounded rough. He backed away from the crack and sat heavily against a limestone shelf nearby. Wind scraped across the ridge above him while Ranger stayed pressed close at his side. Walter hated moments like that. Not because they frightened him anymore, because they embarrassed him. Nobody in town saw those seconds. The sudden shifts, the way memory could ambush a man through sound alone. He stayed there a while before standing again. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped hard enough for sleet to start tapping against stone. Walter secured the tarp tighter and heated canned coffee over a small propane burner while Ranger watched the ridge through blowing mist. The crack remained visible from camp. Dark, narrow, breathing cold air into the fading light. Walter studied it while steam rose from the coffee cup between his hands. Then something near the base of the fracture caught his eye. Metal, half hidden beneath gravel and dead weeds. He grabbed his flashlight and walked back through the sleet. Ranger followed instantly. Walter knelt beside the rock wall and brushed frozen dirt aside with gloved fingers. Steel bolts, old anchor bolts driven deep into the limestone. Not random debris, intentional reinforcement. His flashlight moved slowly across the stone until he found another set farther down. And another. Whatever sat beneath Black Hollow Ridge had once mattered enough for somebody to stabilize the entrance. The wind moaned again through the crack. This time Walter didn't reach for the pistol, but he didn't walk away either. Ranger stepped closer to the opening and stared into the darkness like he already knew something was waiting below the mountain. Snow started falling sometime after midnight. By dawn, Black Hollow Ridge looked colder and steeper than it had the day before. Thin ice coated the exposed limestone. Walter stood beside the tarp shelter drinking stale coffee, while Ranger paced near the crack in the ridge again and again. Same behavior, same focus. Walter finally made the decision around 8 that morning, not because he believed in ghosts or buried treasure, because the bolts bothered him. Mining companies didn't spend money reinforcing useless holes in the ground. He returned to the truck and dug through an old storage bin in the bed, climbing rope, harness, headlamp, dust mask, work gloves stiff from age. Most of it came from repair jobs and old habits he never fully abandoned. Ranger watched every movement carefully. "You stay close," Walter muttered. The dog's ears twitched once. The wind had calmed slightly by the time Walter knelt beside the crack again. Up close, the opening looked narrower than he remembered, barely shoulder width in some places. Too tight for comfort. He clipped the safety rope around his waist and secured the other end to one of the old steel anchors outside. Then he tested the limestone around the opening with slow pressure from both hands. Stable enough. For now. Walter switched on the headlamp. The beam disappeared into darkness. Cold air drifted steadily outward. Ranger moved first. The German shepherd squeezed carefully through the opening with surprising ease, claws scraping softly against stone before vanishing deeper inside. Walter followed. The limestone pressed tight against his shoulders almost immediately. He had to angle sideways to move forward. Sharp rock dragged across his jacket while loose gravel shifted under his boots. 35 feet didn't sound far until a mountain closed around your chest. The air smelled old. Dust, damp stone, rust. Walter focused on breathing evenly while the tunnel narrowed and widened in uneven stretches. His headlamp bounced shadows across jagged rock inches from his face. Ahead, Ranger stopped and looked back once, waiting. Walter kept moving. Then suddenly, the passage opened. The space beyond swallowed the narrow tunnel whole. Walter stepped forward carefully and froze. The chamber wasn't natural, not completely. Concrete walls reinforced parts of the stone interior. Rusted support beams crossed overhead in crooked lines. Old electrical conduit ran along one side before disappearing into collapsed debris farther inside. A Cold War shelter, or at least the remains of one. His light swept slowly across the room. Metal bunk frames lined one wall. Most had collapsed under rust decades ago. Molded emergency water barrels sat tipped on their sides near a cracked concrete platform. A faded civil defense poster still clung to the wall in strips. In case of emergency, the rest had rotted away. Walter moved deeper into the chamber slowly, boots crunching over broken glass and scattered debris. Ranger stayed close now. The dog's posture had changed. Less curious, more alert. Walter understood why a second later. The floor dipped sharply near the far side of the chamber where groundwater had pooled beneath loose rock. Some sections looked unstable enough to collapse under full weight. He crouched beside one of the old barrels and brushed dust away with his glove. Property of West Virginia Emergency Storage Program. The lettering was barely visible. Walter stared at it for a long moment. Nobody in town had mentioned this place because most people probably never knew it existed. The government built thousands of small fallout shelters across the country during the Cold War. Schools, courthouses, rural supply bunkers. Most were abandoned after funding disappeared. Looks like Black Hollow Ridge had been one of them. Ranger suddenly stiffened. Walter noticed the change instantly. What? A low creak answered him from somewhere overhead. Walter looked up fast. Tiny fragments of dust drifted down through the flashlight beam. Not good. He backed away carefully, scanning the ceiling supports. Several beams near the eastern wall had partially separated from the surrounding stone. Years of moisture and freezing temperatures had eaten through the bolts. Another crack echoed through the chamber, louder this time. "Move!" Walter snapped. Ranger turned immediately. Walter pivoted toward the tunnel entrance just as part of the ceiling gave way behind him. The collapse hit like a cannon blast. Stone exploded across the chamber floor. Dust filled the air instantly. One chunk clipped Walter hard across the shoulder and spun him sideways into the concrete wall. Pain shot down his right arm so fast his hand went numb. He hit the ground hard. The lights vanished under choking gray dust. For a second, all he heard was ringing. Then Ranger barked once through the darkness. Sharp. Close. Walter forced himself upright against the pain clawing through his shoulder. Military training kicked in automatically. Assess injury, check breathing, find exit. His right arm still moved. Barely. Good enough. The collapse had partially blocked the tunnel entrance with shattered limestone and bent metal supports. Dust swirled thick enough to burn his throat even through the mask. Ranger pushed against his side urgently. Walter grabbed the flashlight from the ground with his left hand and swept the beam across the debris. No full cave-in. Still space to crawl through, but not for long if the rest shifted. Another groan rolled through the ceiling. Walter moved. Pain stabbed through his shoulder every time he pulled himself forward. Ranger squeezed through the opening first, claws scraping desperately against loose rock outside the chamber. Walter shoved after him. Stones scraped across his back and chest while debris shifted somewhere behind his boots. The tunnel suddenly felt much smaller than before. Too small. His breathing sped up before he could stop it. Dust. Darkness. Weight above him. For one dangerous second, the mountain became something else entirely. Collapsed walls over seas, buried men screaming through radios. Walter shut his eyes hard. "Not there," he muttered aloud. Ranger barked again from ahead. The sound cut through the panic cleanly. Walter locked onto it and kept crawling. One movement at a time. Finally, cold daylight appeared ahead through blowing snow. Walter shoved himself free of the crack and rolled onto the frozen ground, breathing hard. Ranger immediately circled back and pressed against him, nose checking his face, chest, hands. Walter lay there a while, staring at the gray sky overhead, while snow melted against the heat of his skin. His shoulder throbbed badly now, probably strained, maybe worse. But the pain barely registered compared to the realization settling slowly into place. Something real sat beneath Black Hollow Ridge. Not rumors, not old mountain stories. A forgotten shelter buried inside the ridge itself. Walter pushed himself upright carefully and looked back toward the narrow opening in the limestone. The wind moved through it with the same low, hollow sound as before. But now he understood what he was hearing. Ventilation. The mountain wasn't empty, and somebody had once built a way to survive inside it. As Walter gathered the scattered gear near the entrance, Ranger suddenly stopped near a rusted locker, half hidden beneath fallen debris outside the crack. The dog pawed once at the metal door. Walter pulled it open carefully. Inside sat water-damaged folders and a warped clipboard covered in faded names. Local names. Families from Mercer County. Supply assignments. Evacuation lists. And near the bottom of the final page, written darker than the rest, one name had been circled several times by hand. Calvin Grayson. Walter stared at it while snow drifted across the ridge behind him. The handwriting looked rushed, pressed hard into the paper like somebody had gone back over the name more than once. Ranger stood beside the open locker, watching the trees. Walter slid the clipboard carefully into his canvas bag and looked back toward the crack in the mountain. The shelter sat hidden beneath Black Hollow Ridge exactly the way the old mining companies had left it. Buried. Forgotten. Dangerous. But not abandoned. Not completely. His shoulder reminded him of that every time he moved. The drive back into town took longer than usual because his right arm stiffened each time he turned the wheel. By the time he pulled into Mercer County Medical Clinic, dusk had already settled across Main Street. The clinic lights glowed pale against the wet sidewalks. Ranger stayed close as Walter pushed through the front door. A woman behind the reception desk looked up from paperwork. Mid-40s, maybe. Auburn hair tied back. Reading glasses low on her nose. She noticed Walter's shoulder immediately. "You fall?" she asked. "Rock slide," Walter answered. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Where?" "Black Hollow Ridge." That got a pause. Not fear exactly. Recognition. She stood and grabbed a clipboard. "Sit down before that arm locks up on you." Her name tag read, June Whitlock. Walter settled carefully into one of the waiting chairs while Ranger lay near his boots. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. A weather radio murmured softly somewhere behind the counter. June returned with an ice pack and handed it over. "You're the first person I've heard go up there in years," she said. Walter adjusted the pack against his shoulder. "People keep saying that. They're not wrong." She leaned lightly against the counter while filling out paperwork. "When I was little, they used to run emergency drills at the elementary school. Teachers talked about fallout shelters in the mountains. She shrugged. Most folks figured it was Cold War nonsense. Walter looked at her. Black Hollow was one of them? I don't know for sure. She lowered her voice slightly. But old people around here still talk about supply tunnels under the ridge. The clinic door opened before Walter could ask more. A broad man in a hunting jacket stepped inside carrying a coffee thermos. Late 60s, gray beard, weathered face shaped by decades underground instead of sunlight. June nodded toward him. Speak of old people, the man snorted. Appreciate that. Hank Mercer, June said. Used to work mining inspections before half the companies folded. Hank stopped when he heard Black Hollow Ridge mentioned. His expression changed carefully. You been up there? He asked Walter. Walter nodded once. Hank looked toward Ranger, then back to Walter's shoulder. Guessing the mountain answered back. There was no humor in it. Walter studied him for a moment before speaking. You know about the shelter? Hank stayed quiet long enough to matter. Finally, he unscrewed the thermos cap slowly. Thought it collapsed years ago. June looked between them. So it's real? Hank ignored the question. They started building those shelters back in the 60s, he said. Government grants, civil defense programs. Small towns were supposed to have backup supply sites if roads got cut during emergencies. Walter listened carefully. Most never got finished. Funding dried up. Projects got abandoned halfway through. Hank rubbed one rough hand across his beard. Black Hollow was different, though. Couple local men kept checking on it after the state stopped caring. Calvin Grayson? Hank nodded slowly. Your uncle was one of them. Walter leaned back slightly. That landed harder than expected. Hank continued staring into his coffee instead of at Walter directly. Calvin used to come into the hardware store every winter buying vent covers and sealant. Told people he was fixing sheds. He shook his head once. Truth was, he kept that mountain breathing. Outside, rain began tapping against the clinic windows again. Walter felt something tightening quietly in his chest. Not grief, exactly. More like pieces shifting into place. June finally spoke again. Why would he keep it secret? Hank looked toward the darkening street outside. Because once people smell money, they stop seeing value. The words hung there a while. Then Walter's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Eli. Walter already knew how the conversation would go before answering. You still up on that ridge? Eli asked immediately. No. You need to stop wasting time and listen to me for once. Papers shuffled on the other end. I talked to a land rep this afternoon. Energy companies looking at lease options near the North Slope. Walter said nothing. Eli kept going. They'll pay decent money if the surveys come back clean. Enough to get you out of that garage apartment at least. Walter glanced toward Ranger lying quietly beside the chair. How long they've been looking at the ridge? A pause. Does it matter? Yes. Another silence. Couple months, Eli admitted finally. Nothing official yet. Walter looked through the rain-streaked window toward the dark mountains beyond town. So that explained the tire tracks. Don't do anything until I look into it, Walter said. Eli laughed softly. Into what? Rocks? Walter ended the call before the argument could grow. The clinic fell quiet again. Hank studied him for a long moment. Your uncle knew those companies would come eventually, he said. That's why he kept checking the shelter himself. Walter frowned. Why not tell anybody? Pride, maybe. Hank shrugged. Or maybe he figured most people wouldn't stay once it got difficult. That sentence settled deep. Walter understood men like that. Men who carried responsibility quietly until their backs finally gave out under it. June handed Walter discharge paperwork a little later, along with instructions to rest the shoulder for several days. No heavy lifting, she warned. Walter almost smiled at that. Outside, cold rain drifted through the parking lot, while Ranger climbed into the truck. Hank stopped beside Walter before he could leave. The old miner looked tired suddenly, older than before. "Calvin said something once," he muttered. "Couple years back." Walter waited. Hank stared toward the mountains beyond town lights. "He told me that mountain wasn't hiding money." His jaw tightened slightly. "Said it was hiding time." Walter felt the weight of those words all the way home. That night, the wind hit the garage roof harder than before. But now, when Walter closed his eyes, he didn't see empty land anymore. He saw rusted bunk beds underground, ventilation shafts buried in stone, a forgotten shelter waiting beneath a mountain nobody wanted. And somewhere close to midnight, Ranger rose from the floor beside the bed and walked to the window facing north. The dog stood there perfectly still, listening. Walter followed Ranger's stare toward the dark ridge beyond town, where low clouds swallowed the mountains whole. Snow had started falling again. Thick this time, heavy enough to blur the streetlights outside the garage apartment. The weather radio on Walter's shelf crackled softly. Winter storm warning for Mercer County and surrounding elevations. He reached over and turned the volume down. Ranger still hadn't moved from the window. Walter knew that posture. The dog sensed pressure changes before storms rolled in. Always had. Back overseas, Ranger could hear distant rotor vibrations long before anyone else picked them up. Walter rubbed his sore shoulder slowly. He should have stayed in town. That would have been the smart choice. Instead, he spent the next morning loading the truck with supplies. Canned food, fuel cans, rope, flashlights, blankets, a portable propane heater that barely worked half the time. He told himself he was only going up there to secure the entrance before the storm buried the ridge completely. Nothing more. But deep down, he already knew he was going back because he couldn't stop thinking about the shelter. Or Calvin. Or the idea that an old man had spent years protecting something nobody else even remembered existed. By the time Walter reached Black Hollow Ridge again, snow covered most of the access road. The truck tires slipped twice climbing the narrow grade. Wind shoved against the doors hard enough to shake the entire cab. Ranger jumped out first the moment Walter parked. The dog disappeared briefly through blowing snow, checking the perimeter before circling back. "Yeah," Walter muttered, staring up at the ridge. "Feels worse than forecast." The mountain answered with another hard gust. Walter worked through most of the afternoon, reinforcing the tarp shelter and clearing loose rock near the crack in the limestone. His shoulder protested every lift. Sharp pain ran down his arm whenever he raised it above chest level. Still, he kept moving. Work helped, kept his mind occupied. By late afternoon, snow was falling sideways. Visibility dropped fast. Walter secured one final support rope when the first loud crack echoed across the ridge. He froze instantly. Not gunfire. Tree break. Heavy ice-loading branches somewhere uphill. Ranger barked once from near the shelter entrance. Walter looked toward the darkening sky. Time to get below. The wind hit hard before they even reached the crack. Walter barely managed to pull the tarp entrance closed behind them before another gust slammed across the ridge like a freight train. Snow blasted through the trees outside with a hollow roar. Inside the narrow tunnel, the temperature changed immediately. Still cold, but stable. Protected. Walter switched on his lantern once they reached the main chamber. Weak yellow light spread across rusted bunks and concrete walls while Ranger shook snow from his coat beside the old water barrels. The shelter felt different now. Less abandoned. More like something waiting. Walter set supplies near the driest section of floor and tested the propane heater. It sputtered twice before finally catching. Barely enough warmth to matter. Still better than nothing. Outside, the storm grew violent after dark. Wind screamed through the mountain vents in long, low tones that rolled across the chamber ceiling. Sometimes the sound dropped deep enough to vibrate through the concrete floor. Walter hated that sound immediately. Too close. Too familiar. Rotor wash through canyon walls. Distant transport birds approaching an LZ at night. He tried to focus on practical things instead. Inventory. 3 cans of soup. Half a loaf of bread. Jerky. 2 gallons of water plus whatever could be filtered from the old emergency tank if necessary. Enough for a couple days if he rationed carefully. Maybe. Ranger settled near the tunnel entrance, ears twitching every time the wind shifted overhead. Walter envied dogs sometimes. Simple priorities. Stay warm. Protect the pack. Keep moving. No memories attached to sound. Sometime after midnight, Walter jerked awake with his heart hammering. Darkness. For one fractured second, he thought he was back overseas, inside a damaged concrete outpost after mortar fire. He could almost smell burning insulation and diesel fuel. Then Ranger pressed against his chest, hard enough to force him upright. Walter sucked in a breath. The shelter returned around him slowly. Concrete walls. Lantern light. Snowstorm. West Virginia. Not Afghanistan. Ranger stayed close until Walter's breathing settled again. Sorry, Walter muttered quietly. The dog rested his head against Walter's knee. Outside, wind hammered the ridge without stopping. Morning brought worse conditions. Snow had drifted halfway across the entrance tunnel. Walter crawled outside briefly and immediately understood the problem. The storm had intensified overnight. Tree limbs littered the slope. Visibility barely stretched 30 yards. Going back to town wasn't happening, not safely. Walter spent most of the day clearing snow from the tunnel entrance before it sealed completely. The work exhausted him faster than expected. His shoulder weakened quickly in the cold. Ranger stayed nearby the entire time. Watching. Waiting. When Walter finally stopped to rest near the entrance, he noticed his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. That bothered him. Not because he feared the mountain, because he understood how fast small mistakes became deadly in weather like this. The second night hit harder. The propane heater died just after sundown. Walter took it apart twice under lantern light, before finally accepting the fuel regulator had frozen solid. Perfect. The temperature inside the shelter dropped steadily after that. Not deadly cold, but enough to steal energy little by little. Walter layered blankets around Ranger first, without thinking about it. The dog pushed half of them back off almost immediately and settled against Walter's side instead. Body heat. Simple solution. Walter almost smiled at that. Hours later, another sound pulled him awake. Not wind this time. Silence. The kind that comes right before weather shifts again. Ranger stood near the far wall, staring toward a narrow ventilation shaft, partially hidden behind collapsed shelving. Walter grabbed the lantern and followed. Cold air drifted through the opening, but beneath it he caught another scent too. Old metal. Oil, maybe. He pushed loose debris aside carefully, while Ranger watched the darkness beyond the vent. Then the lantern light touched steel. A door. Heavy. Industrial. Half buried behind snow and fallen concrete. Walter stared at it while the storm groaned through the mountain overhead. The shelter had more hidden inside it than he realized. And somewhere beyond that steel door, something waited untouched beneath Black Hollow Ridge. Walter stood in the weak lantern glow while snow battered the mountain overhead. The steel door looked old enough to belong on a submarine. Rust crawled across the hinges in dark streaks, but the locking wheel still sat firmly in place. Ranger stayed close beside him, ears forward. Walter brushed snow and debris away from the bottom edge with his boot. The door had been sealed from the outside years ago, probably intentionally. He grabbed the wheel carefully with both hands. Pain shot through his shoulder immediately. Damn it! The metal refused to move at first. Walter planted one boot against the concrete wall and pulled harder. Rust groaned somewhere deep inside the mechanism. Then suddenly, the wheel shifted. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the chamber. Ranger backed up instantly. Walter paused, listening. Nothing collapsed. Only wind moving through distant vents. He pulled again. The door opened 3 inches before sticking hard against packed debris behind it. A stale wave of cold air rolled out, carrying dust, oil, and the faint smell of mildew sealed away for decades. Walter shoved his shoulder against the steel carefully and forced the opening wider. The lantern light reached into a smaller room beyond. Not storage. Technical space. Control panels lined one wall beneath faded emergency instructions. Most gauges were dead. Electrical wiring hung loose from the ceiling. An old hand-crank ventilation unit sat near the back corner beside stacks of rotting supply crates. The room felt strangely intact compared to the main shelter. Protected. Preserved. Walter stepped inside slowly, while Ranger circled once near the doorway before following. A folding metal table stood against the far wall. Papers still rested on top. Walter picked one up carefully. County Emergency Civil Defense Plan, 1968. Another folder contained evacuation maps covering half the surrounding mountain communities. Small towns, church basements, school routes, winter isolation zones. Walter's flashlight paused over one handwritten note near the edge of a map. Roads likely impassable during severe ice conditions. Shelter access critical. The words settled heavily in the quiet room. This place had never been designed for war alone. It had been built because mountain towns disappeared during storms sometimes. Roads washed out. Power failed. People froze waiting for help that couldn't reach them in time. Walter understood that kind of isolation. He kept searching. Most of the cabinets held useless debris now. Molded blankets, expired medical kits, broken radios. But one locked drawer beneath the control panels caught his attention. The key still sat taped underneath. That bothered him immediately. Whoever left this room expected someone else to come back. Walter unlocked the drawer slowly. Inside rested maintenance logs wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and a smaller notebook. Different handwriting. Calvin's. Walter recognized it right away from the circles around the evacuation roster. The notebook wasn't dramatic. No hidden treasure maps, no government secrets, just years of practical notes written in short, rough sentences. Vent shaft clear on north side. Water seep worse after spring thaw. Generator room unstable. Avoid east wall. Walter sat down slowly in the folding chair beside the table, while Ranger settled near his boots. Outside, wind groaned through the mountain again. He kept reading. The entries stretched across nearly 15 years. Calvin had returned to the shelter over and over, checking vents, clearing drainage, reinforcing weak sections where he could. Most entries ended with weather notes or supply concerns. Then the writing changed near the end. Shorter, less steady. If county roads close again, people will need this place. Another page. Nobody remembers it exists anymore. And finally, near the back. I'm too old to keep climbing this ridge forever. Walter stopped there. Something tightened quietly in his chest. All this time, everybody thought Calvin was stubborn and secretive because of pride. But maybe the old man had simply been waiting for somebody willing to stay. Ranger lifted his head suddenly toward the far side of the room. Walter looked up. There it was again. That low, distant groan through the mountain. Only this time another sound followed it. A faint crackling voice. Radio static. Walter stood immediately. The old emergency radio unit near the wall hissed weakly through blown speakers before fading again. Probably interference from the storm-crossing damaged lines outside, still enough to make the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He checked his watch. Almost midnight. The storm wasn't easing at all. Walter walked back into the main shelter chamber and looked toward the entrance tunnel. Snow had drifted deeper across the opening. Another few hours, and the entire access path might seal shut. Ranger moved beside him silently. Walter crouched near the old water barrels and rubbed a hand across his tired face. The practical part of his brain kept repeating the same thing. Sell the land. Walk away. You don't have money for this. You don't have the strength to rebuild abandoned shelters on frozen mountainsides. But another part of him, the older part shaped by deployments and ruined places and men trying to survive bad conditions, kept looking around the chamber differently now. Not as a ruin, as infrastructure. Hidden, damaged, dangerous, but useful. His phone suddenly buzzed weakly in his jacket pocket. One bar of signal. Eli. Walter answered. You still up there? Eli asked over heavy static. Yeah. You need to come down tomorrow. Weather Service says another ice front's moving in behind this storm. Walter glanced toward the tunnel entrance. Might not be able to. Eli sighed hard into the phone. You're doing it again. Doing what? Finding some impossible project so you don't have to deal with your actual life. Walter stayed quiet. Snow hammered somewhere overhead. Eli lowered his voice slightly. That energy company wants survey access before spring. If you sell now, you walk away clean. No debt, no taxes, no freezing to death inside a hole in a mountain. Walter looked back toward Calvin's notebook sitting open on the metal table. Maybe it's not just a hole. Silence. Then Eli exhaled sharply. You sound just like him now. The signal died before Walter could answer. He lowered the phone slowly. Ranger walked toward the far wall again, stopping near another narrow passage partially hidden behind collapsed shelving. The dog stared toward the darkness beyond it without moving. Walter followed the direction of his gaze. Emergency exit route. Probably sealed somewhere farther uphill. Calvin's notes suddenly made more sense. Vent shafts, escape paths, escape, water drainage. The old man hadn't been preserving memories. He'd been preserving function. Walter looked around the shelter one more time while the storm raged outside. For the first time since inheriting Black Hollow Ridge, he understood the real danger. Not collapse. Responsibility. And somewhere beyond the mountain walls, another storm system was already moving toward Mercer County. The first storm finally loosened its grip 2 days later. Not completely. Black Hollow Ridge still sat buried beneath ice and waist-deep snow in places. But the wind eased enough for Walter to climb outside without feeling like the mountain wanted him dead. The world looked different after the storm. Tree limbs hung shattered across the slopes. Power lines sagged near the lower access road. Ice coated the limestone in dull silver sheets that cracked under his boots. Ranger moved ahead carefully, testing ground before Walter followed. The dog paused often now, listening, watching. Walter spent most of the morning clearing the shelter entrance with a snow shovel and pry bar he'd brought from town. Slow work. His shoulder burned constantly. Every lifted chunk of ice felt like somebody driving nails beneath the muscle. Still, the shelter stayed intact. That mattered. By noon, Walter caught the distant sound of engines climbing the ridge road below. He frowned immediately. Nobody local would attempt Black Hollow after weather like this unless they absolutely had to. Ranger heard it too. The German shepherd turned sharply toward the lower slope, ears rigid. Walter climbed onto an exposed limestone shelf and looked down through the trees. 3 trucks, white company decals across the doors, Energy survey crews, Walter muttered under his breath. Damn you, Eli. The convoy moved slowly through snow and ice until the lead truck disappeared briefly around a bend near the old quarry road. Then came the sound, a deep crack rolling across the mountain. Walter froze. Not thunder. Stone movement. The ridge answered with a violent rumble that shook snow loose from the trees overhead. Move! Walter shouted instinctively, though nobody down there could hear him. Part of the upper slope gave way near the quarry cut. Not a massive avalanche, but enough. Rock and ice tore through the narrow access road below in a crashing wave of broken stone and frozen earth. Walter watched one truck slide sideways hard into a ditch, while another barely stopped in time. Then silence. The kind that follows disaster before panic starts. A few seconds later came shouting. Walter already knew what that meant. The road was gone. Ranger barked once sharply and took off downhill before Walter could stop him. Ranger! The dog disappeared through the trees. Walter grabbed the emergency pack automatically. Flashlight, rope, first aid kit, thermal blankets. His body moved before his brain finished arguing with itself. These were the same people trying to tear the ridge apart. Didn't matter. By the time Walter reached the trucks, snow had started falling again. 3 men stood near the collapsed section of road, arguing loudly, while another sat against the truck tire, gripping his left leg. Young guy. Late 20s, maybe. Badly twisted knee from the look of it. One of the workers turned fast when Walter approached through the trees with Ranger beside him. Road's gone, the man snapped immediately. We can't get signal. Walter crouched beside the injured worker without answering. Swelling already pushed hard beneath the man's pant leg. Not broken, probably. But walking him down the ridge in weather like this wasn't happening. Another gust swept through the cut. Ranger suddenly stiffened beside Walter, then bolted uphill again. What the hell's your dog doing? Somebody shouted. Walter looked toward the tree line. No answer. Then faintly through the wind. Help! Walter's stomach dropped. One missing. Of course. The storm worsened by the minute. Visibility shrank fast as snow whipped sideways through the quarry pass. Walter stood immediately. How many were up here? 5, one man answered. Tom never made it back to the trucks. Walter looked toward the upper ridge where Ranger had vanished, then toward the injured worker, then at the collapsing weather around them. Decision time. The old part of him took over quietly. You, he pointed toward the tallest worker. Keep him warm. Don't let anybody wander off alone. What about you? Walter already started uphill. Getting your man. The climb turned brutal fast. Ice hid beneath fresh snow. Wind tore through the trees hard enough to stagger him sideways twice. Ranger's tracks appeared and disappeared ahead between drifts. Then Walter heard barking. Sharp. Repeated. He pushed toward the sound. Ranger stood near a cluster of fallen cedar trees at the edge of a narrow drop-off. A man in an orange survey jacket crouched beneath the branches, one hand pressed against his forehead. Blood streaked down the side of his face. The man looked up weakly as Walter approached. I got turned around, he muttered through chattering teeth. No kidding. Walter checked his pupils quickly. Concussion, maybe. Mild. Hard to tell in this cold. Snow kept thickening. No way they'd all make it down the mountain before dark. Walter looked toward Ranger, then toward Black Hollow Ridge above them. The shelter. He hated the thought immediately. Those men worked for the company trying to buy the land. But another hard gust answered him with brutal timing. The mountain didn't care who signed contracts. Cold killed people the same either way. Walter hauled the injured survey worker upright. You can walk? Think so? Then listen carefully. Walter pointed uphill. There's shelter inside the ridge. Stay close and don't argue with me. The man stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Walter didn't explain further. The climb back took nearly an hour. By the time they reached the trucks, darkness had started creeping across the mountain. Snow buried fresh tracks within minutes. Walter looked at the 4 exhausted workers gathered beside the vehicles. "You stay here tonight," he said plainly. "You freeze." Nobody argued. Not after another section of ice broke loose somewhere downhill. Ranger led the group back toward the limestone crack, while wind screamed through the trees behind them. The workers stared when Walter guided them through the narrow entrance tunnel one by one. "What is this place?" somebody whispered after stepping into the chamber. Walter looked around the old shelter under lantern light. Rust. Concrete. Cold War walls buried beneath a forgotten mountain. For the first time since finding it, the room finally looked like what it had been built to become. Not a secret. Not a memory. A refuge. Walter handed out blankets and rationed canned food carefully, while Ranger moved from person to person, calm but watchful. The injured worker with the knee sat against the far wall, shaking his head slowly. "If this place wasn't here," he muttered quietly, "we'd be dead by morning." Nobody answered him, because every man inside that shelter already knew it was true. The storm kept them underground until morning. Walter barely slept. Years of habit kept pulling him awake every hour to check the lanterns, the tunnel entrance, the condition of the injured workers. The old shelter groaned constantly beneath the weight of ice and wind above, but the concrete walls held steady. Ranger stayed moving most of the night. The dog checked each stranger carefully before settling near Walter again. One of the younger survey workers finally relaxed enough to reach down and scratch behind Ranger's ears sometime near dawn. "Good dog," he whispered. Ranger accepted the attention for about 3 seconds before returning to watch the entrance tunnel again. By morning, the storm had weakened enough to risk moving downhill. Walter led the group carefully out through the limestone crack one at a time. The mountain looked wrecked. Ice-coated branches covered the ridge road, and the collapsed section near the quarry had widened overnight. Nobody spoke much during the descent. The shelter had changed something. Walter could see it in their faces. These men had arrived looking at Black Hollow Ridge like a worksite. Now they kept glancing back toward the mountain with something closer to respect. Emergency crews finally reached the lower access road around noon. County trucks, sheriff's department, utility workers. Sheriff Doyle climbed out of the lead SUV wearing a heavy brown coat and an expression that looked halfway between irritation and disbelief. "You telling me," he said slowly, "there's an actual shelter under that ridge?" Walter nodded once. Doyle stared past him toward the mountain. "Huh." That was apparently all the sheriff had for a moment. The survey workers explained the collapse while paramedics checked the injured men. One of them pointed back toward Walter almost immediately. "If he hadn't found us," the worker said, "we'd still be up there." Walter hated attention like that. He busied himself checking Ranger's paws for ice cuts instead. By evening, half the town already knew. Small places spread stories fast, especially during storms. The next morning, Walter stopped by June Whitlock's clinic to have his shoulder checked again. Ranger waited beside the chair while June adjusted the brace around Walter's arm. "You look terrible," she said. "Appreciate it. I mean it." Walter almost smiled. June tightened the strap carefully. "Sheriff Doyle's been asking questions about the ridge all morning." "That good or bad?" "Haven't decided yet." The clinic television played weather footage from across southern West Virginia. Ice storms, downed power lines, isolated communities waiting on road crews. June glanced toward the screen. "Funny thing is," she said quietly, "that shelter actually makes sense now." Walter looked at her. "Town loses road access every few winters. Folks always act surprised." Ranger lifted his head when the front door opened. Eli stepped inside. Walter stiffened automatically. Eli noticed it too, but ignored it. Heard you rescued half a survey crew, he said. Walter shrugged slightly. They got stranded. That's not what people are saying. Walter didn't answer. Eli looked tired, less sharp than usual. The kind of tired that came from thinking too long about something you didn't want to admit. June stepped away to give them privacy. Eli leaned against the counter with folded arms. I went up there yesterday, he said finally. Walter looked up sharply. You what? Sheriff took a few of us with county crews. Eli shook his head slowly. You never told me it was real. Walter almost laughed at that. You never asked. Silence settled between them. Then Eli looked down at Ranger lying near Walter's boots. Calvin knew, didn't he? Walter nodded. For years. Eli exhaled hard through his nose. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the clinic roof. I thought he was losing it near the end, Eli admitted quietly. Always talking about storms, supply routes, backup access roads. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. Guess maybe he wasn't. Walter studied him carefully. No apology yet, but something close. That afternoon, Sheriff Doyle drove Walter back up to the ridge with 2 county emergency officials. One was a woman named Denise Harper from the county disaster office. Practical, mid-50s, sharp eyes behind fogged glasses. She inspected the shelter carefully while taking notes. The structure's rough, she admitted, but the location could actually be useful during winter isolation events. Walter stood near the old concrete wall while Ranger moved quietly beside him. Denise pointed toward the damaged ventilation system. You'd need reinforcement, emergency lighting, structural inspections. She glanced around the chamber again. And a mountain of liability paperwork. Walter nodded. That sounded about right. Still, hearing someone discuss the shelter as a real resource instead of a joke felt strange. Sheriff Doyle crouched near one of the old civil defense barrels. My dad used to mention this place, he muttered. Said county officials abandoned it after funding disappeared. Walter looked toward the sealed technical room. Calvin didn't abandon it. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Before leaving, Denise handed Walter a stack of preliminary county forms. Don't get excited, she warned. Approval takes time. Money, too. Walter almost laughed. Money. There it was again. Every path forward led straight back to that problem. Later that evening, Walter sat alone inside the shelter while Ranger slept near the entrance tunnel. Lantern light flickered softly across the concrete walls. Walter opened Calvin's notebook again. Near the final pages, the handwriting weakened noticeably. Roads closed 3 days last winter. Nobody prepared. Another entry. Shelter still dry. Vent stable. Then finally, I can't keep climbing forever. Maybe someone else will understand why this matters. Walter stared at the sentence a long time. Outside, wind moved gently across the ridge now, softer than before, no longer sounding like helicopters or mortar echoes in the dark. Just mountain wind. Ranger lifted his head suddenly toward the entrance. Walter looked up. Headlights moved faintly through the trees outside. Another truck climbing Black Hollow Ridge. A newer one this time. White company logo across the side. Energy Survey Management. Even after the storm. Even after the rescue. Walter felt something heavy settle quietly in his chest as Ranger rose to his feet beside him. The company still wanted the mountain. The truck stopped near the lower ridge trail just before dark. 2 men climbed out wearing heavy winter jackets with the energy company logo stitched across the chest. They weren't survey workers this time. Cleaner boots, corporate posture. One carried a clipboard instead of field gear. Ranger stood rigid beside Walter, low growl barely audible in his throat. Walter rested a hand against the dog's neck. Easy. The older of the 2 men stepped carefully toward the shelter entrance. Walter Hayes? That's me. The man offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. Name's Richard Bell, Regional Acquisitions. Walter already disliked him. Bell glanced toward the limestone opening behind Walter. We heard what happened during the storm. He nodded professionally. Glad nobody got killed. Walter waited. Bell continued. Our company still believes the ridge has commercial potential. We'd like to discuss access agreements before spring. There it was. Even now. Even after men nearly froze on the mountain. Walter crossed his arms slowly against the cold. There's a county review happening. Bell smiled faintly. Emergency shelter designation doesn't automatically stop land development. The second man handed Walter a folder. Numbers sat printed across the top page. Large ones. Larger than Walter had seen attached to his own name in years. Enough to clear debt. Enough to buy a real house. Enough to stop waking up wondering if next winter would break him financially. Bell watched him carefully. You don't strike me as somebody looking to manage a public shelter forever, he said. This could simplify your life considerably. Walter looked down at the offer again, then toward the ridge behind him. Wind moved softly through the trees. The mountains sounded calmer now, almost patient. I'll think about it, Walter said finally. Bell nodded like he already expected that answer. But before leaving, he glanced once more toward the shelter entrance. Mountains out here survive because somebody eventually finds a use for them. Walter didn't answer, because deep down, he feared the man might be partly right. That night, the shelter felt smaller than usual. Walter sat alone at the folding table inside the technical room, while Ranger slept nearby. Bell's folder remained open beside Calvin's notebook. 2 futures. One practical, one uncertain. Walter rubbed tired hands across his face. He knew exactly how much structural repair the shelter still needed. Reinforced supports, drainage work, safe ventilation access, emergency lighting, county permits. Money he didn't have. His shoulder tightened sharply when he reached for the coffee thermos. Even his body kept reminding him this place had limits. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Walter looked up. The dog was staring toward the narrow maintenance passage behind the collapsed shelving again. Yeah, Walter muttered quietly. I know. He grabbed the lantern. The ventilation tunnel needed inspection before spring thaw loosened more rock. Walter kept putting it off because the passage was narrow and unstable. But now avoiding it felt impossible. The tunnel twisted uphill behind the shelter through rough concrete supports and exposed limestone. Ranger moved ahead carefully, while Walter followed with the lantern held low. Cold air flowed steadily through the passage. Good sign. Halfway through the climb, Walter noticed fresh fractures running along the upper wall. Not catastrophic, but worsening. He crouched beside one loose section to inspect the support braces. Then Ranger barked sharply. Walter looked up just as part of the ceiling shifted. Rock crashed downward in a violent burst. Walter jerked sideways instinctively, shielding his face. Ranger yelped. The sound hit Walter harder than the falling stone. Ranger! Dust exploded through the tunnel. Walter scrambled forward through the debris until he found the dog pinned partly beneath broken rock near the wall. Not crushed, but hurt. Ranger struggled to stand and immediately stumbled. Walter's stomach dropped. Carefully, he lifted the heavier stones away while Ranger trembled beneath his hands. Blood streaked across the dog's front leg, not severe bleeding, still enough to shake Walter badly. You're okay, Walter said too quickly. You're all right. But his own breathing had already gone uneven. Ranger finally managed to stand on 3 legs while favoring the injured paw heavily. Walter crouched there a long moment, with one hand pressed into the dog's thick fur, trying to steady himself. The tunnel around him suddenly felt too narrow. Too much dust. too little air. His pulse hammered hard against old memories, clawing upward from places he spent years trying to bury. Not again. Not another partner bleeding in a confined space. Walter shut his eyes hard. Ranger leaned weakly against him. That brought him back. He forced himself to breathe slower. Assess. Stabilize. Move. The cut looked painful but manageable, likely torn paw pad and bruising from impact. Walter wrapped the leg carefully using gauze from his field kit before guiding Ranger slowly back toward the main chamber. Only once they reached open space did Walter finally sit down hard against the concrete wall. Ranger settled beside him immediately, despite the injury. Walter rested his forehead briefly against the dog's neck. For the first time since inheriting Black Hollow Ridge, fear cut through him cleanly. Not fear of debt, not fear of storms. Fear of losing the one living thing that had stayed beside him through all of it. The shelter suddenly felt expensive in a different way. Morning came gray and wet. Walter drove Ranger carefully into town as soon as the roads reopened enough to travel. The local veterinarian cleaned the wound, trimmed damaged tissue near the paw, and reassured Walter the injury would heal with rest. "Couple weeks light activity," the vet said. Walter almost laughed at that. Outside the clinic, Ranger limped slightly, but kept close beside him. Word spread fast again. By afternoon, somebody from the volunteer fire department stopped Walter near the gas station and handed him $50 for shelter repairs. Walter tried refusing it. The man shrugged. "You kept people alive up there." That evening, another envelope appeared taped to Walter's garage door. Then another. Small donations. $20, $40, hardware store gift cards, anonymous notes. Nothing dramatic. Just local people helping the way mountain towns sometimes do when pride finally stops getting in the way. Walter sat inside the garage late that night, staring at the growing pile of envelopes beside Calvin's notebook. Ranger slept near the heater with one bandaged paw stretched forward. Walter looked at him for a long time, then quietly admitted something aloud he hadn't said to anyone in years. "I don't know if I can hold this place together." Ranger lifted his head slightly at the sound of his voice. Not fixing, not rescuing, just listening. And somehow that felt enough for the moment. The next morning, Walter stepped outside carrying coffee in one hand and stopped cold. At the edge of the road leading toward Black Hollow Ridge stood a brand new wooden sign planted firmly in frozen ground overnight. No company logo, no government seal, just carved black letters across fresh pine. Black Hollow Community Shelter. Walter stood motionless in the cold morning light, while Ranger limped slowly to the edge of the road beside him. The sign looked simple, handmade. Fresh sawdust still clung to the bottom edges where somebody had cut the wood recently. No signatures, no organization name, just clean black lettering against rough pine boards. Walter glanced up and down the empty road. Nobody there. For a long moment he simply stared at it while wind moved softly through the trees above Black Hollow Ridge. Then Ranger pressed lightly against his leg. Walter let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The mountain no longer felt abandoned. Spring came slowly to Mercer County that year. Snow melted off the ridge in gray patches. Water rushed through roadside ditches. The old mining trails turned to mud deep enough to swallow boots whole. And somehow, little by little, people kept showing up. Not crowds, just locals. A retired welder brought scrap steel for reinforcing the shelter stairs. 2 volunteer firefighters spent a Saturday helping clear drainage around the entrance tunnel. June Whitlock arrived one afternoon with extra medical supplies sealed inside old plastic bins. Nobody made speeches about it. They just worked. Walter struggled with that at first. Accepting help felt unnatural after years of handling everything alone. More than once, he almost told people not to bother. But each time he looked around the shelter now, he noticed something changing. The place no longer belonged only to memory, or Calvin, or him. It had started becoming useful again. Ranger healed slowly through the spring. The limp faded week by week, though Walter still caught himself watching the dog too carefully whenever they crossed unstable ground. One afternoon, Sheriff Doyle climbed down into the shelter, holding a stack of county paperwork thick enough to choke a horse. Walter looked at the pile suspiciously. "That bad?" Doyle snorted. "Worse." They sat together at the old folding table while Ranger slept nearby beneath the ventilation map. "The county approved provisional emergency use," Doyle said. "Limited occupancy during severe weather events only." Walter blinked once. "That's approval? Closest thing you're getting without spending about $500,000. Fair enough." Doyle flipped through the paperwork again. "You'll need inspections every year. Emergency supplies rotated regularly. Structural reviews after major storms." He looked around the concrete chamber quietly. "But it's official now." Walter leaned back slowly in the metal chair. Official. The word felt strange underground. Doyle noticed Calvin's notebook resting beside the lantern. "Your uncle would have liked this," he said. Walter looked down at the worn cover. "Yeah," he answered quietly. "I think maybe he would have." By early summer, the energy company stopped calling. Not because they lost interest entirely, because public pressure changed things. Hard to drill aggressively into a mountain after half the county started calling it an emergency shelter. Eli admitted that one evening while helping Walter repair washout damage along the access road. The two men worked mostly in silence beside the ridge, shoveling gravel into deep rain cuts, while Ranger rested nearby in the shade. Finally, Eli leaned against the truck bed and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You know," he muttered, "I spent months thinking you'd finally lost your mind." Walter smirked faintly. "Wouldn't be the first time somebody thought that." Eli laughed once under his breath. Then his expression shifted. "Truth is," he paused, "I thought you just needed a project, something to avoid sitting still." Walter kept working for a moment before answering. "Maybe I did." Eli nodded slowly. "But that shelter's real. What it does is real too." No dramatic apology came after that. It didn't need to. Some men only knew how to say sorry through actions. Eli came back the next weekend with fresh lumber for the ridge stairs. That was enough. Summer settled warmly across Black Hollow Ridge by August. Wild grass pushed through old quarry stone. The mountain looked less harsh without snow wrapped around it. Children from town started recognizing Ranger during supply runs. "There's the shelter dog," one little boy whispered at the hardware store. Ranger accepted the attention with patient dignity while Walter pretended not to notice the smile pulling at his own face. One evening near sunset, Walter climbed down into the shelter alone, carrying a small lantern and Calvin's notebook. The chamber looked different now. Cleaner. Reinforced beams replaced some of the rusted supports. Emergency supply shelves lined one wall neatly. Battery lanterns hung near the entrance tunnel beside county inspection tags. Not polished, not modern, but alive again. Ranger followed him slowly through the chamber before settling near the old concrete wall where the ventilation currents moved softest. Walter sat at the folding table and opened the notebook one last time. The final page waited there exactly as before. "I can't keep climbing forever. Maybe someone else will understand why this matters." Walter ran his thumb slowly across the faded handwriting. For years, he'd believed survival meant isolation. Keep moving, stay useful, don't depend on anybody. The military had reinforced it. Life afterward had finished the job, but somewhere between the storms and the shelter and the dog sleeping beside his boots, something inside him had shifted, not healed completely. Maybe it never would. Some nights the wind still dragged old sounds back through his memory. Some mornings he still woke tense before realizing he was safe. But now when Walter heard wind moving across Black Hollow Ridge, it no longer sounded like something hunting him. It sounded like weather, like mountains, like home. He closed the notebook carefully and placed it inside the small glass case mounted near the entrance wall. No plaque, no dramatic explanation. The words could stand on their own. Ranger rose slowly and walked beside him toward the tunnel exit. Outside, evening light stretched gold across the ridge. The handmade sign stood near the trail below, weathered slightly now but still strong. Black Hollow Community Shelter. Walter rested one hand against the rough limestone beside the entrance. Cool stone, steady air moving through hidden vents. Behind him, Ranger settled quietly at his feet. For the first time in years, Walter no longer felt like he was waiting for life to begin again somewhere else. Some places survived because someone stayed. And against all odds, he finally had. Maybe that was the real lesson hidden inside Black Hollow Ridge. Not every broken place needs to become something famous. Not every wounded person needs to become someone different. Sometimes healing begins the moment a person stops running long enough to matter somewhere again. Walter thought the mountain was a burden, something useless, something expensive, something nobody wanted. But in the end, the ridge gave him back something war and loneliness had slowly taken away. Purpose, community, and the quiet kind of peace that only comes when someone, or something, stays beside you through the worst seasons of your life. And maybe Ranger understood that before Walter ever did. Because dogs never care how successful you are. They care if you come home. They care if you keep going. And sometimes they keep a person alive long enough to find themselves again. A lot of veterans, a lot of older people, a lot of lonely people in general, end up feeling invisible the same way that Shelter did. Forgotten until somebody finally looks deeper. So if this story meant something to you, let me ask you one simple thing. Do you believe people can still rebuild their lives after feeling lost for years? Type 1 for yes. Type 0 for no. And if you enjoyed stories like this, quiet stories about loyalty, resilience, and people finding their place again, you're welcome to stay for the next one. Until then, take care of the people who stay beside you in hard times. They're rarer than we think.